Okay, the first thing we'll do is put a 1/4-inch drill bit in our drill motor and then go down to that hole we just talked about a second ago, and we need to drill that out 1/4 of an inch all the way through the case. We'll do that now. And by the way, if you were going to take the trans brake out and then put a manual valve body back in, this modification does not keep you from doing that. Okay, now let me flip it upside down so we can look down into the inside of the case. Okay, now you can see the hole that we just drilled right here. What I want to do is put a 3/8 drill bit in my drill motor and then drill into that hole about 1/2 inch deep, or in other words, until I get to the open cavity that's behind this hole. Okay, let me carefully drill down through there, make sure that I don't drill too deep. All right, we flipped the case around, and now we need to take that 3/8 drill bit and drill into this cavity here, about 2.5 inches deep, until we hit the passage that we just drilled into. Now I'll take my countersinking bit and hit that hole to just chamfer it just a little bit. There you go. Okay, I've blown out all the shavings and the transmission is ready to take a full tree trans brake. This is all the modifications that Robert typically does to his cases. We can look down in this cavity. I'll shine some light and we'll see how now with those drilling of the holes we've opened that passageway up. Okay, you've heard me use the term pro tree and full tree, and the difference between them is how quickly the trans brake releases. Now in a full tree application, which is the way we're setting this case up for, you have all of the fluid pressure that's being built up behind that reverse clutch piston to hold the brake in place. The valve in the valve body is essentially closing off that passageway that we were working on. Now when you release the button, the valve moves and all of that fluid that's behind that piston can now escape out of that passage, and that's the reason why we drilled it out, because we wanted to have a nice unrestricted pathway to allow that fluid to escape. Now in a pro tree valve body you have what some people call a double dump. That is, you have two passageways for the fluid to escape. You have the one we were working on and the one that's next to it. So obviously with having two passageways for the fluid to release, the brake is going to release a lot quicker. You're going to get out of those starting beams a lot sooner. And with the Pro Light, where you only have an amber and a green, that is very necessary. On a full tree, however, when you're running 3 ambers and a green, you can anticipate when to release the button, you know, depending on your skills as a driver, or you can build it into your delay box if you have that. Now Robert typically sets all of his cases up for a full tree, just like we did this one. But he runs a Pro Tree valve body. Now he doesn't take full utilization of it because only one of the passageways is actually being dumped out of, but he just happens to like that style of valve body. Pat, on the other hand, uses a full tree valve body, and the particular brand that she uses allows her to put it in reverse and the car goes right into reverse. With the Pro Brake valve body, and which most of the brands are this way, to get it in reverse, Robert actually has to push the button in, or otherwise the car will just stand still. Now, right now the transmission is already set up for a full tree, and I can just simply put the governor support on the back and start assembling this transmission. If I wanted to set this case up for a Pro Tree, however, I need to make a few more modifications. A couple more holes have to be drilled, and there's an added plate that has to be put on the back of the case, and we'll talk about that now. Okay, I flipped the transmission around right side up so we can take a look at the back and take a look to see what modifications we need to make this case work with a Pro-Tree valve body or a double dump valve body. All right, remember the original hole that we drilled right here? Well, next to it there's another little hole that's in this little horseshoe cavity. All right, we will have to drill that hole out with a 1/4" drill bit, just like the first one, all the way through. Then we would put a 3/8 drill bit on it and drill back a 1/2 inch from the inside of the case, just like we did with the first one. That allows the second passage to be opened up to the valve body. Now, in a normal application, this little horseshoe-shaped passageway is actually for the governor. And of course, in a race application, we're not going to be using a governor, so we can utilize that passage. However, it does create a little bit of a problem. It opens this little area up, this kind of banana-shaped cavity, to that passageway too. So when you fill the cavity up, when you engage your transmission brake, there may be a slight delay in the engagement of the brake because it's got to fill up 2 passageways plus this large area here. So there's some aftermarket companies that make a little, I think it's usually made of aluminum or something like that, and it's in the shape of this little cavity, and it actually fits in there to cover that area up. So then you don't have to be filling that passage up. It will allow the brake to engage a little bit quicker. Also, you have, of course, you've opened up some more areas back here where you have pressure that you didn't have before. So to keep from having a pressure leak on the back side here, the trans brake valve bodies should come with a plate that looks similar to this. And it would be mounted right here, and then you would put your governor support right on top of this. And what this does is essentially block off those passages that you've created to keep you from having a pressure leak on the back side here. Okay, I'll flip the case back around and we can see, you know, the original passageway that we worked on for the full tree. And of course, if I modified this case for a Pro tree, you would have this whole extra cavity that would allow fluid to escape from, and it just makes sense that with both of those passageways together, the trans brake is going to release a lot quicker. Okay, before we leave the subject of transmission brakes, I need to talk about one more item. When you apply your brake, there is a little bit of a problem. As the fluid builds up behind that piston, air gets captured behind it too, and it could cause a slight spongy apply. And so what would happen, you're in the staging beams, you hit the button, you release your foot brake, but suddenly the car rolls forward just a little bit because that piston has not fully applied because it's squeezing that air. So there's got to be a way to release that air out of the back of that piston cavity. There's a couple ways that's done. If you're running an aftermarket case, you're fine because usually the cases are drilled with an extra passage to allow that air to escape. The instructions with some trans brake valve bodies may tell you to drill a small 1/8 inch hole back here in this area. Another method is to drill your clutch piston. I think what you'll find is you use a 1/16 of an inch drill bit, and believe me, you need to use a brand new drill bit, and you need to be very careful because it's very easy to break the drill bit. And you drill down through the face of the piston, and you need to go a little bit to the inside because if you go a little bit too far to the outside, you'll actually drill into the area where the square cut seal rides, and you certainly don't want to do that. And what happens, you put that hole at the 12 o'clock position. So when you engage the brake button, the fluid builds up inside the piston and the air is escaping out of this little hole. But once you get the apply, then the piston is pushed against that back steel plate and essentially covers the hole up. So you don't really have a pressure leak there once you get the apply. Now I believe that's really the hot setup. And you could use this even if you had a vented case. I don't see why you couldn't do this as well. It wouldn't cause any problem. Now a lot of people like to modify the cooling fittings and go drill it out from 1/8 inch pipe tap to 1/4 inch pipe tap and use a larger fitting. It's probably good for extra flow, but there's always a danger. This area tends to be kind of thin on a lot of cases, and you're more apt to crack the case than really get a lot of benefit from extra fluid flow. So I think on this one, we'll leave it like it is. Okay, while the case is all nice and clean, we might as well install the shifter seal, and you do that by putting the lip side in first, facing in, and we want to tap it in flush or just a little bit below flush. I have a 3/4 inch mandrel on my bush and driver tool, and we'll go ahead and knock it in. Okay, it's just about time to reassemble this transmission. I've blown the case out with compressed air again. I want to emphasize you absolutely need to be clean anytime you're working on an automatic transmission. Just a little piece of trash or grit can get in a pressure regulator, cause it to stick. So you definitely want to be clean. I think the first thing we'll start with is get the parking pawl mechanism back in place. Okay, we'll drop the spring back in the case just like that. And this little hook end will go inside the hole that's on the parking pawl. Just like that. Now we'll drop the guide plate in position. I may have to push the paw down just a little bit and then install the 2 screws and tighten them down. 10 foot-pounds if you have a torque wrench. Now we'll take the inside shift linkage and take the parking pin and feed it through under the guide plate between the parking paw and the guide plate. May have to push it down just a little bit and then feed it pin through there just like that. Now we'll take the aftermarket outside shift linkage, feed it through the case and engage it to the inside linkage just like that. And we'll tighten the pinch bolt down. All right, now I want to make sure that the parking pawl mechanism is working good. Very good. Okay, now the orientation of the outside linkage will depend on the brand and the style of shifter you have. All right, next thing I want to do is to put the band adjusting screw in position. Run it in there a little ways. A lot of people like to put a little bit of anti-seize on the threads. All right, that's good enough. Next, let's go ahead and put the servo piston in. Okay, now I said that I was going to use one of the racing style dual ring servo pistons, and here it is. To get the old one off, you just simply remove this clip, take the piston off, put your new one on. You will have to slightly compress it because there is a spring on the servo pin here. So you'll need to compress it on the table just a little bit so you can get your clip back in. Now, I'm using the type of sealing rings that are made of metal. You can also get the Teflon ones, and as a matter of fact, you can also get Teflon rings for the pump. I like the metal ones. However, because they are metal, they need to be slightly compressed. I'll show you what I do. First thing I do is lube the bore up with some transmission fluid. Make sure it's nice and wet. Then I take the heavy return spring, go ahead and stick it in the bore, just like that. Then I just take a regular hose clamp and clamp it over top of those sealing rings. I clamp it down tight and then back the screw off about a half a turn, and I make sure there's a little bit of the edge of the piston showing. Then I go ahead and stick it in the bore and make sure that the piston pin part is lined up with the hole in the case, and then just simply push it in. Works perfect. Okay, you may need to push kind of hard to center that return spring. When it has centered itself, the piston will be in the bore about a ½ inch deep. All right, now we'll take the cover. I've put a new O-ring on the cover and a new gasket. Okay, and what I want to do is line this slide up in the gasket with this hole in the case right here. And we'll just line everything up. and then just push it in, and that O-ring will kind of hold it back, so you'll have to kind of squeeze it a little bit, and then put the 3 bolts in. The torque spec is 20 foot-pounds. Okay, now I'd like to do a quick air check. I'll blow some air down in this apply hole and take a look. Yeah, looks like it's working fine. Okay, next I want to put the reverse piston in. Now remember, this one I had drilled a vent hole in it, and that vent hole needs to go to the 12 o'clock position. Now because the case is upside down, of course, it'll be at the 6 o'clock position. Now I've lubricated the cavity up real good in the case. I've put transmission fluid all over the seals. There is a little bit of friction on these seals, so I may need to use like a hammer handle to tap it into position. Remember, the vent hole will be toward the bottom with the case upside down here. There you go. All right, now I need to take the 17 return springs and glue those in position. Now I will be using the special heavy-duty springs that are designed for a trans brake application. Okay, I have them glued in there with Vaseline as straight as I can get them. And now I need to drop the heavy-duty retainer in position. Okay, now this aftermarket retainer had a slight interference fit on this inside diameter. I had to take a round file and kind of rake around here to kind of hone it out just a little bit to make sure it would fit down in the case. Now as I compress this retainer with the spring compressor I need to be careful to make sure that this inside diameter doesn't get hung in the snap ring groove. Okay, I think I've got it compressed enough. Now I'll take the snap ring. Remember, this is the smaller of the 2 snap rings that's used in this transmission. I'll start one corner at the top and then walk it around with a screwdriver, and I should be able to get it seated in that snap ring groove. There you go. I'll take this compressor off. All right, while we're on this side of the transmission, we might as well put the reverse clutch pack in. Remember, this one will have 5 fibers and 5 steels. And of course the fibers have been soaking in fluid. I've also got the band in the pot soaking. You should always soak the band and the clutches for at least a half an hour before you install them. Okay, and that's the 5th fiber, and now I need to put the pressure plate on. The pressure plate goes on flat side toward the fiber, and there's an index mark right here that needs to go in the 7 o'clock position. And of course, remember, the case is upside down, so it goes up to the top here. Now I'll install the big snap ring. Start it in the groove and work my way around. May have to use a screwdriver to help it along. There you go. Okay, now I'll install the governor support and gasket. Remember, now we drilled this case for a full tree trans brake, so I can just simply reinstall the governor support. However, if I had drilled it for a pro tree, remember, I would have to put this plate on also. One more thing, if we were running a manual valve body, I would need to install the governor to plug up some holes. However, you could also do away with the governor and go down in this hole right here, drill it with a 1/4 inch drill bit about a 1/2 inch deep, and then install a either plastic or steel 1/4 inch ball check. And if it's a little bit loose in there, you might put a dab of epoxy just to hold it in place. All right, and these bolts can be torqued to 15 foot-pounds. And I'll squirt a little bit of transmission fluid on this rear bushing. Okay, now I'd like to do an air check of the reverse clutch, and I'll do that by blowing air down into this passage here. And I'll accomplish that by using this little rubber block here. It's actually an old Ford tool, it has a hole in it. I'll put it right on the case, right over the hole, and then take my air blower and blow down into it. Now, it's not a perfect seal, but it should allow me to hear the piston move, and then I'll be able to look down through this window here and I'll see the clutch pack move as well. So let's give it a try. Okay, I'll center the hole up over the passageway and blow some air into it. And I definitely hear the piston move, and I can also see the clutch plates move as well. And by the way, that's a good place to check your clutch pack clearance with a feeler gauge down through that window. Alright, I'll spin the case around, and now I'll take that double-sided Torrington bearing, put some Vaseline on it and glue it down in the case. Now I'll take the ring gear, and remember this ring gear is for a 1.76 ratio, and I'll feed that down through the reverse clutch until this little ledge here rests up against the pressure plate. Alright, I think I've got it now. Now it may take a little bit of wiggling to get that ring gear all the way down through those clutch plates. And I think it's bottomed out now. Okay, I've squirted some transmission fluid down in the ring gear, and here is the 1.76 planet and output shaft. Again, I've squirted fluid all over the gears and the shaft, and what you want to do before I install it, look down underneath that input sun gear and make sure that thrust washer is centered. Okay, as I feed it down through there, I'll have to kind of support it from the back. And just take your time, and as you get in there, you'll have to kind of wiggle it back and forth to get those gears to spline up. There you go. All right, now I'll take the other Torrington bearing, glue it up, and put it right on top of that input sun gear. Okay, when I glue that Torrington bearing onto the input sun gear, you can see it kind of slides down. So the next step, I may need to take the transmission and set it upright. All right, next, I want to take my new input shaft. Remember, this is an aftermarket shaft that has the Turbo 400 splines, and feed it down through the direct clutch. And I've installed new slip rings here. They install exactly like the slip rings on the pump. Okay, when I get it all the way through, now I need to put that wetting band on the back. Now earlier I did a test fit of the band to make sure it fit good in the sun gear, and it does. I'll just help it in there, get it good and square. And I've put some Vaseline on it to try to kind of keep it in position. Okay, let me see if I can get this input shaft to shimmy down past that Torrington bearing. I'll just take it easy, guide it on in, and I think I got it. And if there was any doubt whether it got past that Torrington bearing, you can always pull the input shaft out and look down through there to make sure that it's seated. Go ahead and put the shaft back in, and now I'll install the band. Okay, pay attention to the orientation. The single tab of the band will face the servo. Okay, I've spun the case around so we can take a look down inside. I'll put the band adjuster strut on first. I'll fish it through the pump side of the case, mount it over top of the adjuster, just like that, and then I'll move the band onto the strut, just like that, and then kind of hold it in place with my thumb. All right, now what I need to do is push the band over so I can get the other strut in. So what I'll do, I'll just take a screwdriver and then just kind of push it in a little bit temporarily. Then I'll take the other adjusting strut and understand the orientation. The little tabs face up on the band side and the tabs face down on the servo side. I'll engage it in the servo first, just like that, and then I'll put thumb pressure on the strut and move the band over and pop it in, just like that. Now don't be surprised if you have to do this 2 or 3 times. It actually took me a couple times before I got it. Okay, I've spun the case around. I've put one of my alignment studs in. Now I'll put the other one in at the top. One at the top and one at the bottom. Then I'll go ahead and lay the gasket down. You may have to flip the gasket back and forth until you find the right orientation. That looks right. Now I'll install the pump temporarily. Now I've left the O-ring off of the pump and I've taken the slip rings off, but I do have the select fit thrust washer in position. Now let me get the pump oriented correctly, slide it into the case over top of the alignment studs, and it should slide right in because you're not using that O-ring, so there shouldn't be any resistance. All right, I'll take 2 of the pump bolts and I put one, say, in this position and one in this position, and I'll tighten it just using my speeder wrench, and then we'll check the end play. Okay, I've mounted the dial indicator on the input shaft just like you saw earlier in the video. I've pushed in on the shaft and zeroed out the gauge. Now I'll push up on the output shaft and see what kind of reading we get. And it looks like we've got about 35 thousandths of an inch. Now remember, the spec is 28 to 59, and I like to see about 35 or 40, and so this is a perfect reading. It's best to take the reading a couple times to make sure it's consistent. Okay, I've pulled the pump back out, I've installed a new O-ring seal, I've put the slip rings back on, and I've lubed everything up with Vaseline. And of course I don't need to change the thrust washer because I got the reading I wanted. Now, if you did need to make an adjustment to the end play, these thrust washers do come in different thicknesses. Plus, there are shims available that can be placed under the thrust washer so you can get a good end play reading. I think now we'll go ahead and reinstall the pump and torque it down. Okay, when you're installing the pump, you can wiggle the input shaft a little bit. That helps it slide in place. Usually you can get it in deep enough to get a few of the bolts started. Then you need to start drawing in the pump very slowly with a staggered pattern back and forth. You want to go in nice and even, because if you start pushing the pump in sideways, you could wind up breaking one of those sealing rings, and you don't want to do that. Also, when you're installing the pump, use the new little seal rings that normally come in the overhaul kit. Now, earlier pumps sometimes used O-rings on the bolts, but you can always use these seal rings instead. They do a better job. Okay, I'll slowly start drawing this pump down into the case. Just go back and forth with your tightening, and you shouldn't have any problem with breaking any of those sealing rings. And once you get it down in there good, take your alignment studs out and put bolts in those holes. Okay, and the final torque is 15 foot-pounds, and this is one area you really should use a torque wrench. It's real easy to rip the threads out of these cases, so if you have a torque wrench, by all means torque your pump. 15 foot-pounds. Be sure you can turn the input shaft after you torque the pump. All right, let's slip this case around and put the extension housing on. Install a new square cut seal ring for the extension housing. Put it right over top of the governor support. As you install it, make sure you don't twist it. All right, put your extension housing on. Run your bolts in, and these bolts can be torqued to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, now we'll make the band adjustment. The way I do it is just tighten the band screw up with an Allen wrench, nice and firm by hand, and then back it out 3.5 turns. You can use a torque wrench. I think the spec is 70 inch-pounds, and then back it off 3.5 to 4 turns. I think if you just use a Allen wrench and get it good and firm by hand, back it out 3.5 turns and you'll be fine. 1, 2, 3.5, and then run the lock nut down, tighten it up. Okay, just before we install the valve body, let me show you a mark that I made on the inside of the case right here. Now, in a race application, it's very possible that you will have to fabricate your dipstick tube and dipstick. So you need to know where is full. All the literature I can find says that the full mark should be about 3/4 of an inch above the pan rail. So I've measured down 3/4 of an inch down into the case, and I've put a little paint mark. So now I can put my dipstick tube in that I'm going to fabricate, go ahead and put the dipstick in, and then use that mark as a reference. I'll just simply go over from the paint mark to the dipstick, put a little X, scribe a little X on the dipstick, and that will tell me where full is. Now, the racing valve body that we're going to be using, it has a full tree trans brake setup. That is, when we look underneath the valve body, we will see this single hole here, and this hole corresponds with the hole that had the passageways drilled out earlier in the video. Understand, if this was a Pro Tree trans brake valve body, there would be another hole right in this location, and that would correspond with this cavity here. Again, this is a full tree brake, so it just has the single hole. Okay, to install the valve body, 3 things need to be lined up. We have to put the servo tube in the valve body, and the other side of the tube has to go into the hole in the case for the servo. The manual valve has to line up with the linkage on the shifter, and this little detent roller has to go over top of the rooster cone right here. And if you just take your time and be careful, you can get all 3 things lined up at the same time by just simply watching what you're doing and drop the valve body in position. Let's give it a try. Just kind of wiggle the valve body just a little bit to make sure it's seated. Take the guide plate, line the slot up with the little tang on the manual linkage. Put one long bolt here, and right now I'll just put a couple threads on it, finger tight. The short bolt goes right here. I'll make sure that my linkage works, no problem at all. Now I'll put the rest of the screws in. After all the bolts are in finger tight, then run them in with a speeder wrench the rest of the way. And the torque on these bolts is fairly critical. It's 15 foot-pounds. By all means, if you have a torque wrench, torque these to the 15 foot-pound spec. If you do not have a torque wrench, I believe if you get it good and snug with a speeder wrench, you'll be pretty close. At least you won't have it over-torqued. So let me swap over to my torque wrench and finish torquing the bolts. Now, by the way, if you had an inch-pound torque wrench, it would be 180 inch-pounds for these bolts. Okay, it looks good. Now we need to put the little detent spring on. There we go. Move the shifter. Very good. Okay, remember I said I was going to use a deep sump aluminum oil pan. So the pan that I got came with an extension for the filter. It has this little aluminum block, and with 2 gaskets. The one gasket goes right there. Then you have the aluminum block spacer, another gasket on top of that, and then of course the filter and 2 longer screws to bolt the filter down. Now it just so happens that the screws that came with mine were a little bit too long. I thought, well, maybe I can put a couple washers under the bolts, but that won't work because what happens is the oil pan hit the top of the heads of the bolts. So I had to take about 1/8 of an inch off of the bolts, and it works just fine. And so don't be surprised if you have to make a modification like that on yours. All right, let's go ahead and line all this up and put the filter on. Okay, now I'll drop the oil pan on. Now the pan had a little bit of a clearance problem too. Let me show you that. Okay, I discovered that the valve body casting right here hit the oil pan right in this location. So I had to take a die grinder and kind of whittle away a little bit of the material on the oil pan right in this location. I understand that this is not uncommon. So, you know, be sure that you check yours out for any kind of clearance problem. Now I'll put the valve body brake valve in position. It goes right where the old modulator went. You see how it's oriented. This side goes in, this part goes against the solenoid, and it should just go right on in. No problem, just like that. Now I'll put the solenoid in place. Now some people might put some pipe tape around the threads. I think I'll put it up dry. I believe I'll be all right. And I'll just thread it in. Now this has a very large hex head here. I think it's 1.5 inches. I don't know if you have a 1.5 inch open end wrench. I don't. I think I'll just use some channel locks and just be real careful. I should be fine. All right, that should be good. And by the way, your valve body may be set up a little bit different. The valve may look different. It may even have a spring mounted on it. Drop the pan gasket in place. Put the oil pan on. And then run the screws in finger tight. Now this pan came with some longer screws because after all the cast pan is a little thicker than the stamped steel pan that was on it. Get all of the bolts in finger tight first. And then you can run them all down with the speeder wrench. I think the torque spec is 8 foot-pounds, but frankly, I think if you get it good and firm with a speeder wrench, you'll be okay. Okay, with the transmission right side up, I want to install the torque converter. Remember, there's 3 things that have to line up. The lugs for the oil pump and the splines for the stator support and the input shaft. Okay, you may have to turn the torque converter several revolutions before everything lines up, and it looks like I'm in deep enough now. I'll take my yardstick, my straight edge, and go across the front of the bell housing, and I see that the little flats on the torque converter is about 1 inch deep past the straight edge. That's what you normally want to see. However, it depends on your setup, whether you're not using a mid plate or you're using a mid plate and the style of flex plate that you're using. You need to let the torque converter company know what your setup is. Then that way they can put the correct offset on these flats, plus they can create the correct depth on this pilot hub. So that way everything will line up. When you get this bolted to the engine, you should see about 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 play between the flats on the torque converter and the flex plate itself. Now, by the way, all sanctioning bodies are going to require a flywheel shield for these type of transmissions, and normally to mount one on, you will need to take a Sawzall and cut this little tab off the top. You usually have to cut these little tabs off the side. You will have to look at the instructions for your flywheel shield to see what needs to be cut. Always put a new O-ring on your dipstick tube. After the transmission is installed in the car, you should have the rear end up on jack stands. I would say put a gallon of fluid in the transmission, start the engine, then put say 2 quarts in and start checking your fluid level. You want to have that rear end off the ground because you never know. You might not have this shifter adjusted exactly right. It suddenly goes into gear and guess what? Out the back of the garage door you go. Also, anytime you're going to be operating the trans brake, you need to have that flywheel shield in position. Now I think that concludes this aspect of building a drag race prepared Powerglide transmission. I hope I took some of the mystery out of it, and as always, good luck on your project.